Welcome to TechC Turbo, a tech podcast providing independent technology content and perspectives. My name is Frank Gullo, and I am your host. On this episode, we're joined by Jamie Bono, a principal consultant at EmergenceTek Group, where he designs information architectures and leads data platform strategy across healthcare, environmental services, and financial sectors. Before EmergenceTek, Jamie spent nearly a decade as a paramedic in the Buffalo-Niagara region, then studied English at the University of Buffalo and at the University of Pittsburgh, where he was also a Homeland Security Research Fellow. Jamie went on to lead data integration and analytics for Medicaid redesign and value-based payment initiatives, then built NLP pipelines and knowledge graphs as a senior engineer in UB's Department of Biomedical Informatics. Today, Jamie's work centers on context engineering, structuring the information around systems so that people, teams, and AI agents working inside them can actually reason well. Jamie also serves on the board of CCNY in Buffalo, New York. Jamie, we've been talking about this for a while. I'm really excited to have this conversation. How are you doing today?
We're doing great, Frank. Thanks a lot for having me on. I'm really excited.
Oh, absolutely. And very excited for others to hear your insights. So, that intro was a lot. And I really want to dig into how one gets to paramedic to data engineer. So this is a tech podcast, Jamie. So let's start from the beginning. And your beginning is genuinely unlike most people I've had on the show or even met. You were a paramedic for nearly a decade. How does someone go from running calls in Buffalo-Niagara to building pipelines and data infrastructure? What connected this for you and how did you get where you are?
So that's a really interesting question. When I started volunteering on the ambulance in high school, it was the only place where I could access a computer. So was an unexpected part of it. But as a consultant, the skills are really very similar. It's about being able to work with people, being able to apply a kind of triage instinct to be able to enter a situation where the stakes are really high for the people that are there, and then help to identify reasonable solutions into immediate problems. It's a lot like walking into a client's data environment, you have to be useful fast and you don't always have all of the information and the stakes are really high. So I think it's more similar than you would think.
Right. So anyone out there who's a paramedic, looking at different careers, data engineering may be one. So Jamie, we've talked and you've mentioned watching patients in your past work cycle back for the same preventable problems: housing instability, food insecurity, transportation. At what point did you decide the answer to these problems wasn't necessarily better emergency response, but better data? And what did that shift feel like?
So to be honest about it, I didn't see when I was working on the ambulance, I didn't see these as larger social problems. I saw them as kind of what we understood in the moment as part of the kind of lore of emergency services, which is, it looked like people were abusing the system. It looked like they were calling 911 to get seen in the emergency room faster, or because they hadn't planned well enough to get a primary care appointment or things like that, right? So when someone has the flu and they call 911 at 2:00 in the morning, a lot of times as a paramedic, it just looks like poor planning. But when I got access to data as a specialist working on Medicaid redesign stuff, those were the questions I wanted answers to, because that's what I knew, right? And so I went looking for things like, is there evidence that people call 911 and then when they get to the hospital, they don't go into the ER? So is there an ambulance bill and no ER bill? Things like that. And I found that the reality in the data didn't really bear out the stories that I had been hearing and for a long time. But what I did see were these larger issues like access to care and barriers to care, right? So a lot of times that it's not that they're not compliant with their meds because they don't want to take them. It's that they have no way to get to the pharmacy. And what was nice is that I was able to, because of the people I was working with, was able to ask people with broader experience than me and different experience what they saw. And I was really lucky to work with people with long histories in case management, behavioral health, and primary care, and housing security and food access, and see how these things that I was seeing with a different set of tools changed the way I saw the problems made them look different than they did from the back of an ambulance.
That's fascinating. And I think it's really interesting that this was all before your data engineering, because a lot of what I hear is when you were a paramedic, you had a very small part of the data piece. And it sounds like now you've zoomed out and you have larger context. And we're going to talk a lot about context and AI systems. And, I wonder how much people in their normal roles, right, they have a piece of data, but as you zoom out, you get a bigger picture. So we'll certainly get into that as we're, talking about AI. But back to your path. So you went through disaster planning, Medicaid redesign, grad school for technical communication, biomedical informatics at UB. That's a very non-obvious seeming sequence. So looking back, does it all come together? Is there a pattern to it? And what were you actually pursuing through those different pieces?
Very different answers at the time and in retrospect, right? So at the time, I was really excited to solve complicated problems that seemed exciting. I also liked having a high degree of autonomy, right? So it was really nice as a paramedic to be able to make decisions in the moment and have ownership of those decisions. And then as a student to be able to have that same kind of agency. And then in both, I taught a lot. I really enjoyed teaching. I enjoyed teaching new paramedics. I enjoyed being a field training officer. I enjoyed even on scenes, like teaching bystanders and family, like why I was doing the things I was doing, or even patients, because it made patient care easier and more effective. And I really liked reading. I sit in the ambulance all day, and when you're not busy, you just read, right? And so there was a lot of consistency there. So it was kind of like, where else can I do these things that I like? And then now when I look back, one aspect is it's really nice to feel needed, right? And as a paramedic, you feel needed, right? And as a consultant, you feel needed, you feel important, right? But I think really it's about, all of them are about how information is useful in the moment, right? How it flows through systems and where it gets kind of jammed up, right? So how do we communicate these things more clearly? How do we plan to respond to things in ways that we can teach other people, right? So I think a lot about sometimes, I think CPR is a really good example, right? Because it takes this huge body of clinical knowledge and physiology and chemistry and all these other things, and it distills it down into a set of things a 12-year-old can do in an emergency, right? It distills them down into very simple things that are shaped for the context.
Excellent. Yes. And everyone, make sure you know where your defibrillator is, right? In your office. And
yeah, right. And so at the end of the day, it's like, check for responsiveness, airway, breathing, circulation, do compressions, call 911, right? And it becomes repeatable.
Right. And that's a good segue into really favorite topic, context engineering and agentic AI. So you use a phrase I want to dig into, context engineering for intelligent systems. For listeners who think of AI mainly as their chatbot, the chatbot that has gotten to know them, or a code assistant, explain what this phrase means, context engineering for intelligent systems, and why you use it.
It's a great question. So I want to start with the formal definition because I can't take credit for it. So the formal definition really comes back, it's only a couple of years, maybe a year now. The CEO of Shopify posted about context engineering on X as a broader category that prompt engineering fits in, right? So prompt engineering being like this way you ask questions in order to get responses, or the way you instruct the LLM to respond. He really said that context engineering is about providing the context that the LLM uses to reason and make decisions. I'm using the term reasoning pretty loosely, right? And then Andre Karpathy, narrowed it down a little bit more and said engineering is shaping that context and making sure it fits in the window, making sure that the AI has access to it. And then now we're reading a lot about how it's this process of creating the set of rules that help the LLM or the AI perform in the way you want it to perform. I kind of take it a little bigger. because I did spend a long time, like you said, in English programs studying rhetoric and technical communication and how we write plans and protocols and these things. And so I really thought that it wasn't that novel. It was really something we've been doing in rhetoric and technical communication forever, which is how do we decide what the right information is to give people to be able to make decisions in the moment, right? So I use the CPR example again, right? Like a 12-year-old doesn't have to know about the history of cardiology. They just have to know what to look for and how to respond because that's what's needed in the moment. And so I like this idea of context engineering for intelligent systems in that, like LLMs don't operate alone. So humans are part of that system. Humans together form really complicated intelligent systems. And so how do we provide those actors with the tools and the information they need in order to make sound and reasonable decisions? Now that chatbot kind of trap that you talk about that a lot of people run into is that when you're chatting with an AI or chatting with an LLM, the context is getting generated on the fly, right? So we call it like one-shotting, right? Which is where I ask it a question and then it gives me a response and I say, no, do it like this. And then I say, no, go do this Google search, right? And it's this back and forth that is really inefficient. And I think it's because a lot of people are using search, like the way they used Google and other search tools as the dominant kind of frame for that, right? That's the context they have for I type something into a box on a computer and it gives me a response. When we design systems, we look at things like instructions, system instructions, prompts. We look at templates, like how to respond to things. Those are all part of the context, which frames the conversation. And so, yeah, it makes it a lot more efficient.
And that, yeah, and in that matter, if the AI is only as good as the context you give it, so average business user, we've handed them a new paid account, whether it's Copilot or Claude. What would your advice for them? Should they like feed it everything in their department folder, or do they want to be selective with the new business users who are coming into this tool?
Well, I would ask a complimentary question, which is, how would you onboard a new employee? Right. So if you onboard a new junior teammate, you don't necessarily start by giving them the entire history of the company, right? Like that has a purpose, right? It doesn't help them necessarily fulfill their immediate need, their immediate goals. And so I think of onboarding large language models and other systems like that very similarly. What do I need it to know to complete the tasks that I want it to complete within the specifications that I have? That doesn't mean that I don't enjoy giving these systems more broader instructions to see what they can do. But it's a tool, right? So the question really is like, how do I onboard it onto the team, not treat it as a surrogate for my thought process, right? Like I don't want to give it everything I know. Part of my expertise is being able to bring in the information that it's necessary to solve a current challenge.
Related, many people I speak to talk about AI focus on a particular model. Which one, which version, which prompt, they go back and forth. You seem to focus more around the model, the knowledge graphs, the information architecture, the layers. Why do you focus on the surrounding structure as much as the model and more than most people?
Well, the models change super quickly. So what is a state of the art or frontier model now is a frontier model for weeks. The development cycle has been compressed a lot. So I think that focusing on the model is focusing on the tool. It's focusing on one thing, and that thing changes. I like that things like ontologies and knowledge graphs and ways of encoding information. And I'm going to extend this to kind of not sexy areas like data governance, right? Like these are things that work across systems, not just one model, multiple models, mixture of experts systems where you're asking a lot of models to make a decision, human systems, human in the loop systems, right? Context generalizes really well. It scales really well to lots of different systems where a model is just one tool. Now, that doesn't mean that certain approaches to context engineering work better with certain types of models. It's clear that there is a linkage, but I do think that the work done in information architecture and knowledge, and context engineering and now, coding knowledge pays off in larger dividends than just being applicable to one model. Right? It's like learning English, right? Like if I learn English, it unlocks lots of different things, not just being able to speak English, I guess.
Yeah, makes sense. So you build and run AI agentic systems regularly, and there's a lot of conversation about agents right now. There's a lot on LinkedIn and other places. What does a well-designed agentic system look like from a practitioner perspective day to day? And what is a poorly designed one that starts to break down?
Well-designed one is invisible. A well-designed one should, in my opinion, should really fade into the background and reduce friction. A lot of what I get asked to do as a consultant or as a data engineer is to design systems that address areas of high friction, business processes that are really time consuming or resource consuming, places that are valuable where automation is valuable. So I think that the best design systems disappear. What's the saying, right? That the best design is 99% invisible, right? Like that's I really think that's true. I think that poorly designed systems are really visible, and they usually look fairly similar. So they don't have guardrails. They have a lot of description of what you want the system to do, but not a lot of description of failure modes or anti-patterns or what not to do. So that's a tough one. And without guardrails, you get sometimes you just get beautiful garbage, right? You just get this like proliferation of things that are close to accurate, but aren't always accurate, right? They perform accuracy really well. I think that a lot of it comes down to automating things we don't understand yet. So trying to automate a process that you haven't spent real effort unpacking and understanding. And that's a lot of what I do as a consultant is talking to people about why they make the choices they do and how they make the choices in order to make sure that we can give proper context to an agentic system.
You think there's been an agentic tipping moment yet, like a super agent? Like I remember when P2P, when Napster seemed to really change how people thought of what was possible with the internet. And I feel we're close, but I don't know that we've had a super agent yet. Do you think that's come yet or is close?
If it is so well designed, we don't see it. Right. I mean that only kind of partly as a joke, right? Like, I think there are frontier models that are clear market leaders. And there are a variety of reasons.
Well, it's Mythos, right? Mythos we've heard of, but we don't see it, right? Or is that like a hype model?
I think it remains to be seen, right? I think it remains to be seen. I think that the hype cycle is a lot more often tied to the funding cycle than it is to the technology development cycle, right? I think if there is something out there, we haven't really clearly identified it, and it's operating at a level of transparency that is in a way exciting and terrifying, right? I think they all create new problems, right? I think that's the other part of it. I think that it's iterative, right? I don't think that I think if there was an Uber model that really made the difference, then it would create a whole bunch of other challenges that we haven't even, and maintenance surfaces that we haven't identified yet. So it would create new failure modes and new challenges that we'd have to design for. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. But luckily, you help contribute to some of the solutions. And what I mean by that is, I know you follow a system, which you call write once, use everywhere. A one project brief that feeds meetings, status reports, proposals, AI context, etc. So for someone listening who's drowning in context switching, or for someone new who's just getting into this space, Where does this start, and how would you recommend they get started with this level of scaffolding around AI?
So first, it's about understanding what AI is good at, or what large language models are good at, right? They're good at pattern recognition. They're good at reproducing things. They're good at iterating on things. So I try to identify a very few set of constant nagging problems and then build frameworks around them. So you mentioned ones like the project brief and the meeting notes. In the course of a day, I might meet with 6 clients and I need to be able to be on top of that discussion with each client. So for years, I've really worked to keep a lot of notes, a pretty consistent note-taking process in order to just do that without AI. AI allowed me to amplify that and make it a lot more efficient and a lot more consistent. So the recommendation that I give to a lot of people is find one area like that, build a template around it, build some instructions around it, iterate on it. So identify when it fails and how it fails, and then iterate to make it not fail that way again. And start just working that one set of processes in a very focused way. So for me, the meeting cadence of identifying what my meetings are for the day, building templates for note capture for the meetings, capturing notes, knowing that I'm transcribing usually, and then having a post-meeting workflow for cleaning up those notes, reading and summarizing them, and then writing my own action items. There's another big failure mode here, and that is a lot of times using AI isn't a problem when the AI gives you the wrong answer. It's a big problem when it gives you the right answer and you stop looking. I've been hearing a lot of people talking about this lately, and so that's the other trap. The other trap is to create a template and have the notes look really pretty, but then never actually do the work of reading the notes or preparing for the next meeting. And so you end up with this drift where your intelligence has less to access because you've offloaded a lot of these cognitive processes. You've offloaded a lot of this overhead to the machine, which is, again, great at taking notes. But if you don't read them and groom them and kind of go through them, you don't know if they're any good or if they're useful for you as a person, because ultimately that's the context I care about in those meetings. That's the big one. As an engineer, my code has never been as well documented, right? Because I can give the coding assistant a very strict template for how I want my code documented. I can tell it to diagram or describe in very specific ways. It can look at a much larger context window than I can. So it can simultaneously hold hundreds or thousands of lines of code and architecture in quote unquote, like in memory in a way that I can't. And so that's another place where I think it's really useful, right? Find these really well-structured, high-value places and let the assistant assist.
So a big part of your work has been with healthcare and nonprofits, organizations that are almost always under-resourced but carry enormous data responsibilities. In your experience, what are the specific failure modes you've most often seen with these organizations as they try to build or buy data systems?
The primary failure mode that I see in under-resourced organizations is largely related to operating from a scarcity mindset, which is challenging now with that large language models, right? So a lot of smaller nonprofit organizations or underfunded organizations are really good at solving the same problem over and over again with new tools. With whether it's whatever they have on hand from a staffing perspective or a funding perspective or a technology perspective. I think this is one of the reasons why Excel is so consistent across things, is that it is accessible in a uniform way. And I know there are still organizations out there who are probably running key processes on someone's, undergrad license Excel subscription, right? But they're used to operating from the scarcity mindset. So they burn a lot of resources doing the same thing over and over again. And a lot of that is because they're always stuck. So in emergency management, we used to talk about the life cycle of emergency management, right? Which was preparation, response, recovery, and mitigation. And they go in a cycle, right? And people fund. There's a lot of money for the response and recovery portions. There's not always a lot of money for the mitigation and preparation portions because they're not as visible. So a lot of these organizations get stuck in just those two parts and then they never get to reintegrate the knowledge that they gain from responding and recovering. They never get to reintegrate that into formal systems or protocols or reproducible things. And some of that is just they don't know if the licenses for the software are going to be there next year, right? So why design around it? But there's a lot of energy that's expended in that cycle. And so they become dependent on vendor relationships that have a lot to do with lock-in. And this isn't just not, this is a lot in technology, is that vendor lock-in becomes an issue, data sovereignty, being able to get the data out in a meaningful way. It's just challenging. It has a lot to do with funding, like everything else. But yeah, I would say the primary failure mode is kind of solving the same problem over and over again in slightly different ways. The other is also thinking that their non-technology skills are not useful to technology. I think the most important skill I have learned as a consultant is something that I learned from social workers, which is like motivational interviewing. How do you get somebody to identify what the problem is and what the needed solutions are, and then come up with a reasonable plan for solving those things? And so that's a really powerful thing. And a lot of these organizations are run by social workers, run by people who have these skills. And I think that they sometimes get so stuck in the obviously high value areas of making sick people better and helping people, which is what they're there for, that they don't see the transition. They seem to think that the technology part is somehow special, or it's something outside of their purview.
Interesting. And well related, you and I serve together on the board of CCNY, which among other services provides data capacity building for health and human service organizations in and around Buffalo. So from your perspective, what does this look like on the ground? The need, the practice, the workflows?
So one of the things and there are a lot of things I love with CCNY. So if I have to narrow it down to this, right? One is that their staff sits at the intersection I was just talking about. So their staff are a lot of excellent program builders and analysts and statisticians and frontline people with lots of frontline service delivery experience. So they understand that. The other thing is, because they are able to focus on measurement, program design, measurement, evaluation, and reporting, they are able to have a little bit more time and a little bit more consistency than the people who are trying to straddle service delivery and reporting and these things, right? So one of the things that was nice about, and I just want to go back for a second, like one of the nice things about moving from the ambulance to Medicaid stuff was I just had more time to think about problems and to look at things at a different scale. And I think that an organization like CCNY has the ability to work with multiple organizations and collect best practices and kind of encode that at a higher level that isn't so concerned with the immediate response mode or the immediate failure mode or solving the immediate problem. They're able to look at it in a broader way. It allows them to train in different areas, right? It allows them to focus on, things like how do we develop better systems that not only help our team, but help us to provide better service. So I think that it offers, it's one of those rare organizations that bridges multiple disciplines in a way that's productive, but that doesn't reduce the work to either discipline. It doesn't necessarily try to solve every human services problem as if it's a technology problem or vice versa. They have a really good community of practice there that helps do a lot of knowledge exchange. We have a wonderful information architecture, right? That's what, right? Like that's the.
Yeah, great. And I think that systems lens, really positions them well as they do begin to add more AI and automation, and they're very well high functioning, a team in my experience. Okay, in closing, so you've started a new blog, a new Substack, and within it, you've written about approaching data systems by asking what it's like to be the objects inside them. And this is fascinating, like a SQL view, a spreadsheet, a color-coded cell. That's not a typical consulting framework in my experience. So first of all, introduce the blog for us, and where does that come from, and how did it change what you see when you walk into a client engagement?
So thanks, Frank. I appreciate that. So my Substack is called Copia, and it's jamiebono.substack.com. Copia comes from quintillion. It's a rhetoric term. It's a abundance of preparation. So it's kind of reflects my approach to context engineering and these other systems, right? We prepare a lot so that in the moment we can improvise, in the moment we can draw on the needed context from an abundant set of preparation. So the idea comes from object-oriented ontology, it comes from philosophy, and this question of what it's like to be a thing. I kind of arrived at this approach because the problems people asked me to help solve were usually problems with things like a number on a spreadsheet or a report or a specific piece of code. And so a lot of times it was helpful to look at the life cycle of that object. So, and how it interacts with other systems and how it, constrains or enables things. So one of the common ones is color-coded cells in Excel, right? This is a personal problem, right? Like I get it that for a person that color-coded labeling is really useful, but for the system, it's challenging because it's not easy to put into a database, right? So looking at where objects come in contact with other systems is really helpful for unpacking problems and then finding solutions. So if you look at a spreadsheet, a CFO sees a number, the operations team sees another number, analytics is maintaining that number. But if we trace the root cause of it, it is, one query or one thing that moves through its own independent life cycle. It touches multiple departments, touches multiple concerns. And so those things are usually not part of the equation. They're usually seen as tools and not as actual constituents in the system. So Harman talks about how like those objects withdraw. They're not always easy to see. And so I think part of my job as a consultant is to kind of go in and talk to people and look at their systems and draw those objects out and say, how does this object work? What are the objects we see? And where can we find opportunities to, this is going to sound like a terrible, but to give those objects kind of a better life cycle or a better life. And so, and how does that then help the overall system, right? So, my transition from EMS to Medicaid really kind of very clearly showed me that my perspective was partial and that and that it was really useful to be able to dig in and see these other perspectives. And so Bogus, I think, gives me the vocabulary to kind of talk about that a little bit, but it's consulting, right? It's really unpacking a complicated system and trying to track the life cycle of information and things through that system.
Fascinating. And I have to say, I had a couple other thoughts when I read that. Number one, Samuel Beckett, because I also was an English major like you, wrote Waiting for Godot, but he also wrote a book called The Lost Ones, which the whole book is about these objects in a spherical object, right? So that's the whole story. So it kind of reminded me of your distillation of these objects through a system. The other thought I had is some of these objects will in effect be employees soon as these agents take on full-scale roles. So I think people will begin to think of them in your terms more because they'll be doing jobs, right? They'll be doing task work, which humans will be overseeing and managing. So I think it's very interesting beginning to look at it, almost personifying, right, these objects and processes because they're going to be super important.
Well, and Frank, I don't think it's new, right? Like I don't want to say this is new or novel. I think it's a problem we've always had in technical writing and technical communication. And I know it really becomes visible in disasters and in emergencies, but we see it all the time, right? So when systems fail, we will often blame the documentation or the plan or the planning, because it is an object we can put blame on without moral judgment, as opposed to blaming the people who made the choices in the moment, where we didn't have to make those choices.
Right. Or as opposed to it being a black swan event where there's no, blame, right? Because the whole event is, a new experience.
With its own life cycle, with a beginning, a middle, and an end, and maybe not necessarily its own agency, but its own effect. And so I think it's a move that has always been around, and I think that it's interesting too when you start asking questions about how large language models and AI changes things in the workforce, right? Like, ultimately, it's important to remember that they're tools. They're tools that we've talked a lot about them having agency, and we've called them agents, which I think is a somewhat inconvenient nomenclature, but they're tools. They are things that are designed to be used. And when they fail, they become very visible. And so I think that the metaphor is apt. I think it's a useful way to look at these things. It also, as a consultant, lets me sometimes look at things and put blame on that view and not on the people who have to maintain it, or that one system and not on the people who have to maintain it, who have real opinions and feelings about it. And so it allows everybody to kind of take a look back.
Right. And it also allows us to have a metaphor to the Matrix. But with that, good place. I think it's a good place to park it. So Jamie, it's been really great having you here. You mentioned your Substack. Where else can listeners find you if they want to follow your work?
All the usual places, LinkedIn, GitHub, pretty much LinkedIn, GitHub, Substack. Those are the places to find me.
Awesome. Jamie, thanks so much. We'll have to do this again.
Thanks a lot, Frank. Appreciate you.